Okay. Good morning. This is Geography 10, Lecture 8. I want to start today with a discussion about the movie that we watched on Tuesday, Grass. On the title slide here, this first slide, if you've printed them out, go ahead and cross out "and ills" after weeds, because we're not actually going to talk about ills today. Mainly, we're going to talk about the movie, and then we're going to talk about weeds, and then we're going to talk about invasive species. Couple of housekeeping matters. First of all, as I indicated in an email on Monday, I believe it was, or anyway, earlier this week, we are going to take everybody who's on the waiting list and put you in the class. What this means is if you're on the waiting list and you don't want to take the class, you're going to find yourself enrolled, which means that if you want to drop, you're going to have to pay the registrar $10. And I know such a person, if such a person exists, is probably not in the hall right now and can't hear me anyway. Nonetheless, I feel it's necessary to alert you to this. In other words, if you don't want to take this class and you're still on the wait list, drop it, like before 2 o'clock this afternoon. Okay? I think this is all going to work out as far as enrollment. So, just as I had hoped. One other little piece there is that in order to do this, we have to provide for some way of handling the possibility that there will be more students taking the midterm than there are seats in this room. What that means is that I have reserved another room, and we will take the sort of overflow from this room to that room, along with the DSP students, on the day of the midterm, which is the 9th, March 9th. Okay? But we'll figure that out ahead of time so that we don't have to waste your time walking from here to there. We'll figure out some way of deciding ahead of time who's going to go over to Macomb and use a room over there for the midterm. We may have to do the same thing for the final. Other housekeeping matter. There will be no class on March 4th. We will have the review session, which was going to happen on March 4th, some other time before the midterm. Okay? Any questions? Any thoughts about the movie? How'd you like it? I'm getting virtually no reaction. What did you think of the movie? It was all right. How about you? Yeah. Favela Rising was better. He didn't like this one so much. Why not? Okay. All right. Who agrees that the topics are more interesting in Favela Rising than Grass? All right, a handful of you. Anyone feel the other way around? Okay, we're getting a high rate of abstention in this little straw poll that I'm trying to conduct. Where should we start? Human-livestock interactions? What did you see in this movie? Or should we? Yeah, go ahead.
I thought it was neat the way they used the goat skins to cross the river. I thought that was an interesting human-livestock relation.
Okay. You need to get across a raging river with a whole bunch of animals, and you don't have a boat. But you do have a whole bunch of goat stomachs. No problem. Pretty clever. Pretty amazing. Kind of hard. You wonder where they carry all those goat stomachs when they're not using them to cross a river. And how they manage to maintain them such that they will actually hold air. Any other interesting, any of you wish that you had been born into this society and could do this yourselves twice a year? No? How does it compare to backpacking in the Sierra? Is this a form of recreation, these migrations? pretty burly. Don't you think it should be featured in, like, Outside Magazine? The gnarliest thing you can do with your vacation? Yeah. Why were they barefooted when they were going through the snow? Well, we can speculate. First of all, they don't have a lot of really nice Gore-Tex boots. They can't get those very easily. I suspect that it's because that any shoes or foot protection that they chose to produce for that part of the walk would be destroyed. And that, therefore, it doesn't make sense to, I mean, why put a whole bunch of effort into making a bunch of shoes only to have them, you know, basically destroyed in the space of a couple days? Why not just go barefoot? That's my guess. I don't know for sure. What did you see that they possessed that they presumably could not produce themselves? Yeah. Guns. Anything else? Yeah. The hookah. Good question. Could they produce a hookah on their own? Yeah.
Shovels and picks.
Shovels and picks. So basically things made out of metal, right? And that's about it as far as things that are clearly beyond their own means of production, so to speak, right? So it would appear, I mean, who knows how they get those things, whether they get them through some kind of barter or trade, where they have to go to get them, whether the people who they get them from are themselves nomadic or traveling around and they encounter them and swap. Who knows? They probably trade animals for guns and ammunition. Other than that, they are, it would appear, capable of producing everything that they need themselves because they have all these animals, right? What else? Any other? Did you find it unbelievable? No? No one? Everyone? Yes. If you check out the 1976 remake, there's a nice little map graphic thing at the beginning that portrays on a map the migration in a sort of finer scale. And because the movie only shows you one of the tribes, right? There are actually quite a few others that are not in the movie. So the 50,000 people and 500,000 animals includes the broader tribe, as far as I understand it. But if you look at the way they move through the mountains, this is not something they can do in a day or two. This is something that takes quite some time to achieve. And all along the way, they've got to make sure that their animals can eat, right? And what this means, because they're moving up these valleys, is that they sort of break up into smaller groups and then reconvene in such a fashion that when they get to a big valley where there's a lot of grass, they can pause and let all their animals, you know, stock up on food again before setting off further up. In other words, they have to be very careful about not just when they leave, but each step along the way, they have to make sure that there's enough grass and enough water for all their animals. And why is that such a tricky decision to make? Why? I mean, the whole ritual thing at the beginning, it's not quite ritual, I suppose, but the meeting that they hold at which it's decided that it's time to go. Why is that such an important decision? What are the things they have to think about in deciding when to start on this migration? Yeah. Okay, we're actually here. This is the spring migration. So it's the other way around. The point is correct. They are trying to time this in relation to the spring thaw. And what kinds of factors does that affect? Yeah. Okay, the crossing of the river. That's a key point in this. And how would you decide? I mean, if you're sitting down at the beginning of the migration, presumably you don't have a live webcam showing you that spot on the river where you're going to cross. You don't know what the river looks like at the time that you set off. What happens if you wait too long? The longer you wait, the bigger that river gets, right? Because what's going on is that the glaciers up in the mountains are melting. The snowpack is melting. The river is rising. So the longer you wait, the more dangerous that river is likely to be, the more animals and potentially people you stand to lose crossing that river. What else? Yeah? Okay. They have to think about the grass, and they have to think about the grass in two different places, right? They have to think about it where they're at when they start. They are feeding their animals on the winter grass, which is to say the grass that grew whenever it was last warm enough and wet enough to grow. And presumably it's not growing anymore in the wintertime because it's too cold. And they will run out of grass if they wait too long. And if they wait too long and run out of grass, their animals will start to lose the strength that they need to make it over the mountains. On the other hand, they also have to be thinking about the grass on the other side of the mountains, right? They don't want to get there until that grass has started to green up. And that will happen in the spring as it gets warmer. The plains of Iran are a lot higher than the Tigris-Euphrates floodplain area where they start. And they need to get there and have grass there that is green already. So if they leave too early, hoping to minimize the size of the river, for example, they might get over the pass and down to the other side and discover that the grass hasn't greened up yet. And that would also be bad for their animals. In case you are wondering, grass is a whole lot more nutritious. Most grasses are a whole lot more nutritious for animals when they're green than they are when they have dried out. What else? What about this territory that they occupy? How is it marked or delineated? Do we have any sense of the territoriality of this tribe? Dead silence. All right, that question's going on the midterm. Yeah. Okay. 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 Right. Okay, it doesn't seem like they have territory. Not in Delaney's sense, right? It doesn't seem like there is an inside and an outside, a clear boundary around their territory. It probably is the case, in fact, that they know very well what the boundaries of their territory are. And yes, they matter insofar as they relate to other groups of people who might choose to use that territory or move across that territory. Yeah? Okay. Okay. The desert police. The police on camels. And that is in a different place. That's down in what's now Iraq as they're making their way from the Kurdish territory, sort of south and east, the length of Iraq, to the Bakhtiari. And at that point, the movie is set in the midst of vast, open desert. And these police represent who? What? Any ideas? They are the police. They represent the government, right? And they are, in a sense, asserting the territorial sovereignty and the police authority of that government over that space. And to the extent that they succeed in doing this, they are in fact consolidating the territoriality of the government, right? Of the state at that point in time. And we'll talk later about what exactly the form of government was in that region in this time period. That was very much in flux. Nonetheless, they are the official enforcers of the law in that space. We don't see any such people patrolling in the Bakhtiari territory, do we? What about the fact that that landscape appears to be as rugged and inaccessible as it is? Do you think it would be helpful if the government embraced the Bakhtiari as citizens and decided that this is a backwards area, these people need to get some progress, they need to benefit from the technologies of the modern world, and therefore we're going to implement a development project? What do you think the first thing such a project would be likely to do is? Yeah. Bingo. Build a road over that mountain. Would building a road over that mountain benefit the Bakhtiari? Yes? You think so? Why? Yeah. What do we mean by benefit? Okay. And? Okay, a road would make their trip easier, presumably, and that might be a benefit to them. They might be able to make it more quickly. They might be able to make it without losing as many sheep. Maybe give them a bridge across that river. On the other hand, you got to start wondering what the other effects of a road might be. And not just the question of whether it would alter Bakhtiari culture, which no doubt it would, but what else is it about roads that is, yeah. Okay, presumably, unless you gave the Bakhtiari exclusive control over the road, presumably what the road would really do most is make the area more accessible to other people, right? People who don't know how to make it across that pass with their animals and no trucks, right? And that very likely would create conflicts between the Bakhtiari and whoever decided that they had an interest in utilizing that space, right? And the effect of a road would very likely be to eventually make that migration and that livelihood more difficult, if not altogether impossible. Who knows what the resource might be that would attract outside interests, whether it would be mining or something else. But chances are that the road looks like it would help them, but very likely would not help them in the long run. Any other thoughts about the movie? Okay, let's try this straw poll again. How many of you actually liked this movie? Okay. And how many of you thought it was a total waste of time? Oh, good. All right. Not many. Maybe one or two. All right. Here's the update. The readings for today. Crosby, chapters 7 and 8. For Tuesday, I'd like you to read Crosby, chapter 9, and the article 1491 by Charles Mann. And then for next Thursday, Crosby, chapters 11 and 12. All right, let's talk a little bit about weeds. Here is a map depicting external migrations, the movement of people between major parts of the world since 1500. The width of the arrow is an indication of the rough number of people involved. And the colors indicate different groups of people. I assume you can read the legend here. So the largest migration by far, since 1500 is of Europeans moving to North America. Second largest, well, there are several here, Africans moving to the Americas. Here the vast majority of it is the slave trade, which we'll talk about in a week or two. You also see quite a few migrations from other parts of the world that perhaps are less well known and that we have not talked about. Migrations from South Asia to the eastern coast of Africa and to the United Kingdom. Migrations from East Asia, China, both to North America and to Southeast Asia. Migrations, the blue line, the migration of European Jews from Europe to Israel, Palestine. The movement of Mexicans and Central Americans from Mexico north into the United States. So you see a great number of movements. The big one from Europe to North America is the primary focus here, right? And in many ways, this is a depiction, a cartographic depiction of the phenomenon that Crosby's trying to explain, right? How is it that such a massive migration succeeded? And you can see also the skinnier green arrows of Europeans migrating to the Neo-Europes, right? The southern cone of South America, Australia. These are the other places that Crosby is designating as the Neo-Europes. And the chapters for today about weeds and animals are a more detailed discussion of the other parts of the portmanteau biota, right? And the next chapter, which we'll read for Tuesday, is about germs, basically, about diseases. But those are the ills. But for today, we want to talk about plants and animals. And his case is that these plants and animals also went with the Europeans, and that in certain parts of the world, they not only flourished, but were instrumental to the success of the people establishing in those areas, and led to the dominance of those people in those areas, and the disappearance or near disappearance of the native peoples who had been living there before. And today we're going to talk mostly about the plants, his discussion of weeds, and then I'm going to try to bring this up to date in a discussion of invasive species issues today, and talk a little bit about the differences, if there are any, between the kinds of things he's describing from contact, hundreds of years ago, and the situations that a lot of conservation biologists and environmental groups are concerned about today with invasive species, both plants and animals, in different parts of the world. So this is a little bit of a side step for a moment. Clarence Glacken, who is a geographer here at Berkeley and who wrote a book called Traces on the Rhodian Shore, which is a study of Western theories or studies of the relationship of people to the environment, nature and society, going all the way back to the ancient Greeks and even before then. And he brings it forward to about 1700. It's an enormous book. And he concludes, he offers as a sort of overarching thesis that there are three dominant trains of thought or frameworks, paradigms, you might say, in the Western tradition for thinking about this relationship between nature and society. And they're pretty simple looking on the face of it. But that's what you get when you try to generalize from the entire Western tradition over, 4,000 or 5,000 years. The first is that nature determines society. And when I say determines, what I mean is shapes, influences, right? That societies are a function of or are conditioned by the nature, the environment in which they find themselves. And environmental determinism is the sort of extreme version of this way of thinking about nature-society relationships. The other one he identified was the other way around, that society determines nature. In other words, human societies alter their environments. They produce certain kinds of changes in their environments to facilitate their own growth and well-being. You might wonder, this sounds more like the sort of modern sensibility of environmentalism, in which humans are a sort of outside force that affects the environment, frequently for ill, right? Frequently with damaging consequences. But it's actually got a very long history in the Western tradition. This is not a new idea. And then the third is that the two fit together in some harmonious way, that each is somehow disposed to facilitate the other. Humans are magnificently well suited to exploit their environments because they have brains, and they have thumbs, and they walk upright, and they have language. And this is somehow magnificently well suited to the environments in which they live, right? It enables them to take sticks and turn them into tools and use them to plant food crops, that kind of thing. And meanwhile, on the other hand, nature appears to also be beneficently, nicely designed, right? We have fertile soils and climates that are suited to our needs. We have day and night and whatever else it is in the natural world that we are attuned to. And the predominant sort of perspective from which this paradigm evolved, or within which it evolved over most of the Western tradition, was a sort of theological or religious one, right? This fit between the world and people was seen as evidence that God, or some kind of divine creator, had put this together in this magnificent way. That this harmony between nature and society, or nature and humans, was sort of miraculous. And these were things that we had to interpret as sort of given to us by the Creator. Now, that's not to say it's the only way you can have this kind of thinking. This is, again, there's a modern variant on this in which you sort of combine these three perspectives and you say, okay, yes, humans affect the environment. We can do all kinds of crazy things to make the environment better for our needs, but every once in a while, nature gets the upper hand, right? We build a bunch of levees along the Mississippi River because it facilitates transportation and trade and development of industry along the shore and home sites and commerce. But then every once in a while, nature comes along and gives us a huge flood or a huge hurricane, and suddenly those levees look like not such a good idea, right? These are, again, three big ways of thinking about nature and society. And I would encourage you to think about this question of invasive species with respect to these theories, right? Do invasive species fit neatly into any one of these? How do we want to think about the interaction between organisms other than humans, the environments in which they move and reproduce, and the human societies that in some cases do these things on purpose, in other cases do them by accident. Some cases it works out very nicely and everyone's happy. In other cases it leads to various kinds of disasters. And what is it that makes these dynamics possible? On the one hand, there is a very, very long temporal depth to it, right? Insofar as we're talking about evolution. We're talking about evolutionary timescales at which these organisms become what they are, adapted to a certain environment. On the other hand, it can accelerate and become a very abrupt process if these organisms then relocate to another environment altogether, one to which they are perhaps poorly adapted, perhaps they're well adapted and other organisms aren't well adapted to it. They come without their predators and suddenly find themselves released, so to speak, to reproduce at astronomical rates. And this is what invasive species today are about, and in many ways, this is what Crosby's argument is about. Any questions? So Crosby writes, any respectable theory that attempts to explain the Europeans' demographic advance has to provide explanations for at least two phenomena. The first is the demoralization and often the annihilation of the indigenous populations of the Neo-Europes. Sorry, that S is missing. Second, we must explain the stunning, even awesome success of European agriculture in the Neo-Europes. The first piece of this is going to wait until next time. That's the ills. The second part here is where the weeds and the animals are critical. What is a weed? I think I've mentioned this before. Any plant that spreads rapidly and outcompetes others on disturbed soil. That's a fairly technical definition. The more general one, which I think I mentioned before, is a weed is a plant out of place. A weed is a plant somewhere we don't want it to be. They are the result of evolutionary adaptations to natural disturbances such as fire, landslides, droughts, floods, extreme storms, etc. We've talked about disturbances before, I believe. Anything that creates bare ground facilitates not only the spread, but in fact the evolution of weeds. And most of what we call weeds are plants that colonize bare ground. And they do it before something else comes along to do so. They do it quickly. The receding glaciers following ice ages also favored such adaptations. So if you think here again on very, very long time scales, as glaciers receded from the northern hemisphere, from terrestrial parts of the northern hemisphere, they would leave behind huge areas that had been disturbed, right? The plant cover had been killed and wiped away by the ice and everything that was in the ice, the sand and the gravel and the rocks. And plants that could colonize those newly exposed bare ground areas quickly had an evolutionary advantage, right? Crosby says, weeds are not good or bad. They are simply the plants that tempt the botanist to use such anthropomorphic terms as aggressive and opportunistic. And he says, typically, weeds are self-limiting. He says the only thing that keeps a lid on weeds is their own success. They will move quickly into an area that's been disturbed, and they will establish and they will flourish there, but they will then essentially give way to other plants precisely because they will change the conditions. It will no longer be bare ground. The conditions, the habitat conditions on those sites will now have shade, probably greater nutrients as the plants decay, and the conditions will eventually be such that other plants will establish and the weeds will give way. And this is generally known as succession for ecologists and is well established in many parts of, well, for most systems, there's empirical support for this general framework, although the dynamics, the larger dynamics, are frequently much more complicated. All right, any questions about that? Now, on the face of it, it would seem that Crosby's argument is rather implausible. How can the weeds have been a benefit to the Europeans in the New World, or the Neo-Europes, if the weeds themselves were seen as enemies or as problems, right? Weeds are a scourge if you're a farmer, right? So if you're moving into a new landscape and you're trying to establish farms, maybe your crops do all right, but if your weeds do really well too, then you've got a problem, right? So it would seem like this is not a very coherent argument for Crosby to be making that the weeds actually are agents of this ecological imperialism. Cultivation and plowing, the basic practices of domesticated agriculture, are human-caused disturbances of soils and plants to favor for particular plants. So we intentionally plow the soil and plant our crops, and then we intentionally cultivate, which is to say, go through and remove the weeds in order that the crop plants can thrive. But in doing these things, we almost invariably produce habitat for weeds, especially where the crop species is an annual plant. Right? If the crop species is going to germinate and grow and then die, you are left at the end with nothing but bare ground, which is magnificent habitat for weeds. And this imposes what can rather clumsily be called a kind of inverted artificial selection on or for weedy species as humans struggle to eliminate them and they adapt to survive. And this is perhaps even more importantly the case with germs than it is with plants. But it also is very true with plants. Now, what do I mean by this, right? If our business is to destroy the weeds, then we are not selecting for the best the way we do with crop plants, right? We're not picking the best ears of corn and replanting those seeds. We are systematically wiping out the weeds that are doing the best, right? The ones that are creating the most problems for us. And in doing that, we are imposing a selective pressure on those weeds, right? The weeds that, for whatever reason, get in our way, our hope is that they won't reproduce. Nonetheless, some of them will reproduce, either because we don't quite get to them or because they're growing slightly off to the sides or something like that. And essentially what you get is, over evolutionary time, you get species that are constantly figuring out how to reproduce in spite of what we're doing. They are finding a way. They are mutating and being selected precisely for this regime of pest control, weed control, that we're imposing on them. Why does this matter? Why is this important right now, today? Any ideas? Any of you concerned about artificial fertilizer use? You know, synthetic fertilizer use, yeah. Okay, I've got something else in mind. What's the, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, stuff you might use to kill weeds you adapt into.
Okay. The primary way that we control weeds in agricultural fields in this country today is how? Chemicals. Herbicides. Chemicals that kill plants by chemical processes, right? If we use those chemicals over and over and over again, what kind of weeds are going to survive? The ones that figure out how to survive in the context of the prevalence of these herbicides, right? In other words, what you get is, over time, an artificial selection pressure that essentially guarantees that eventually there will be weeds for which this herbicide does not work, because you are putting pressure on them to such that the ones that mutate and survive flourish and reproduce. Only the ones that are susceptible to that chemical die, and presumably they decrease over time. The ones that find some way to resist the chemical persist and reproduce. And over time, what you have is a kind of treadmill effect in which the very success of the chemical guarantees the resurgence of the problem further down the road. And all proposals for alternative ways of controlling weeds sooner or later come back to this is not going to work in the long run. This is irrational. There needs to be a better way to do it. And if you start thinking about vast landscapes that are homogeneous, cropped with the same plants, with the same fertilizers and pesticides employed, what you are creating is not just this pressure at a small scale, you're creating it at an enormous scale. And if a weed species arrives from someplace else or mutates locally that has a way of dealing with this, you've got the possibility for a massive spread and outbreak of that weed. And with plants, we might not think that's quite such an issue, but when it comes to crop diseases, it's potentially an enormous issue. You can have the same thing going on there, resistance of the organisms, the diseases, to the chemicals being used, such that you are essentially creating a new problem on a larger scale down the road. Now, we're going to talk after the break. We're going to watch a couple little YouTube videos about invasive species today. I want to talk briefly about invasive versus non-native. Are these terms you've heard of before? Non-native plants, non-native animals, invasive plants, invasive animals. They are sometimes used in a way that might lead you to think that they're synonyms, that they essentially mean the same thing or can be used interchangeably. And in some cases, they can be used interchangeably because in some cases, a plant or a pathogen or an animal is both invasive and non-native. But these are not identical categories. They overlap, but they are not the same. There are such things as native invasives, plants or animals that are native to that system but are suddenly behaving differently than before. And there are also non-invasive non-natives. Not every plant that comes in from some other place, and therefore is non-native to that place, behaves in an invasive fashion, right? Invasive species are a major biodiversity threat worldwide, and we'll see that in these YouTube videos in a moment. But it's worth, I think, asking about the anthropomorphism of both of these categories, which is to say they are interestingly built around human metaphors, right? Invasion definitely conjures up ideas of being invaded by some kind of outside enemy. Non-native, what does that mean? Would we call people native to North America? Would we call white people native to North America? Okay, let's say we don't call white people native because they only got here 500 years ago. But we know from the Pleistocene overkill hypothesis and the work of paleoecologists that all the other people only got here 15,000 years ago, give or take. Why does that make them native? Well, sure. I mean, it's a convention. It's simply a convention. The point is not that somehow one is right and the other is wrong. It's simply that both are essentially arbitrary, right? Where do you decide, how do you decide where to draw that line in space and time and say, oh, these are native, those are non-native, right? Because we know that these things have moved and changed and evolved and mutated. The idea of a naturalized species is a kind of shortcut way of dealing with this problem, right? If some organism, if we want to fight back against this invasion, we won't say that it's a naturalized species. We'll say it's non-native, it's invasive, and we're going to kill it. To say that it's naturalized is to sort of admit defeat and say, oh, well, it's been here, it's kind of gotten used to the place, it's been here so long, it's so widespread, it's naturalized. Which means we're just going to live with it. And it's a little creepy when you start thinking about the way, naturalized plants, naturalized animals, and then, of course, there's naturalization of humans through various kinds of immigration. For citizens, we actually have a formal procedure in which we suddenly say, aha, now you are naturalized. You're a citizen. All right. Let's take our 5-minute break. And when we come back, we'll watch some videos, and I'll talk a little bit about this place. Okay. Let's get started again. Assuming that you've read the 2 chapters from Crosby, the punchline here is fairly simple. Right? The chapter about weeds describes the amazing, unbelievable spread of weeds to the Neo-Europes, in the Neo-Europes. These plants that came from Europe and found themselves in these new places and just went hog wild, so to speak, right? Spread sometimes well ahead of the edge of sort of the frontier settlement, right? And then the next chapter talks about the animals, the pigs and the sheep and the cows and the horses that also spread and flourished in the Neo-Europes, and in some cases reproduced in sort of astronomical numbers. And Crosby's point is these animals, whether they were tended by humans directly or not so much, moved in and had a great time in these landscapes and reproduced like crazy, which meant that they provided a potential food source, and they also radically reorganized the ecosystems they were in. And in many cases, they overgrazed, right? They would reproduce so much that they would exceed the potential supply of forage, grass, and you'd get a whole bunch of bare ground, and bingo, you would have the condition for the weeds. And he even goes so far as to say these weeds actually served a purpose in stabilizing those soils such that they eroded less than they might have in the absence of these weeds. So you got a new system, so to speak, in which the animals and the plants took over and sort of mutually reinforced the conditions for each other. And here, the ways in which animals can eat herbaceous material of almost any kind. I mean, these livestock are incredibly flexible in what they can eat. Creates a condition in which suddenly you've got essentially a new landscape, one to which native peoples and plants and animals were less well suited, so to speak, than the Europeans. Okay, and there are great anecdotes about this. There are particular cases that are remarkably dramatic, and whether you're talking about rabbits in Australia or cattle in the Great Plains in the 1860s, there are many, many stories that are like, whoa! And now we're going to see some of these stories as they are playing out today. Okay, we've got about 6 or 7 minutes. Any reactions to these videos? They're frightening. What's the most frightening thing about them? Okay. There are frightening risks that these organisms pose. This is stuff going on right now. Bufflegrass, when I moved to Tucson in 1992, bufflegrass was not something you heard very much about. And it is now, as you can see from this video, something that even the real estate community is very agitated about. Yeah. Okay, Asian carp in the Mississippi River. There are countless examples of stories like this from all over the world. Others?
I don't know if they're called, but in trees, they look kind of like nests, but it's some kind of disease.
Mistletoe?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was in England over winter break, and along the
mistletoe in England. I'm not familiar with that one. Yeah.
I think it's kind of ironic how they were like really worried about the environment as it affected like people being able to go to the resort.
Right, right. It is rather funny to look at those people playing golf on that nice green at Star Pass and listen to the owner or the manager of the Star Pass resort talk about the importance of the environment. There are some deep ironies here. I mean, I would suggest that in addition to the scariness of the actual invasions and the possible implications they have, you know, whether it's the loss of saguaros or whether it's the loss of fisheries in the upper Midwest, some of the rhetoric that's being employed is also kind of scary, isn't it? This, you know, procrastination is not an option. We've got to mobilize. I mean, it really sounds very much like sort of you're either with us or you're against us kind of. The discourse surrounding these things can get a little bit frightening, especially bufflegrass also, it should be mentioned, it overlays in a really weird ways with the human migration issue along the border in southern Arizona. Because basically bufflegrass established in northern Sonora and in actually hundreds and hundreds of thousands of acres of desert in Sonora have been bulldozed to plant bufflegrass, frequently backed by the Mexican government or the state of Sonora, at one point actually backed by international development agencies as a way of creating pasture for livestock in areas that are too low and dry to support native forage. And I mean, that's lower and hotter, but the grass, I talked with a geneticist, an expert in grass genetics many years ago, Mexican man, and he emphasized that bufflegrass can mutate very, very, very quickly each generation, and that basically it was making its way up a gradient, getting more and more adapted to slightly cooler, slightly wetter conditions, and it was moving north and east up into Arizona, moving across the lower deserts as we saw in the video, dominated by saguaros, Sonoran Desert, and eventually making its way to Tucson, which is at about 2,500 feet elevation, which is about twice as high an elevation as where it was previously suited. And in other words, the bufflegrass, simply through mutation, was adapting and was able to move at a rate of potentially many kilometers every year up this long gradual slope into southeastern Arizona. I want to just very quickly give you a few slides here of work, of a place where I've done some work, where the picture is actually very, very different. This is slightly higher. You keep going north and east in this part of the world, and you get higher and higher and higher, and you get to a point at about 3,500 feet elevation and above, where the dynamics turn around completely. And in fact, the vegetation is dominated by grass, native grasses. This is a picture of native grass. And fire in these systems actually is an important part of conserving the native vegetation. Although there are a bunch of other complicating factors, I just want to give you a quick picture of it. So this is what it looks like in this area after there's been a good winter rainy season. This is what it looks like after 15 years of drought. It's not the same site, but it's very nearby. This is maybe 15 kilometers away. And this is an area that on average gets about 16 inches of rainfall a year, which is plenty of rainfall to support a nice stand of grass. But this is what it looked like. And that previous picture, this one, is only about a year later. These are the storms that you get in the summertime. If it rains, these huge monsoon systems that are very localized. The point here that I want to stress is that you can get 3 inches of rain right there, and just over here next to it, it might not rain at all in a given summer storm. This is what most of this area looks like now. A mixture of perennial grasses, which you see in the middle there, and mesquite shrubs. And the mesquite, 50 years ago, mesquite was the bufflegrass of southern Arizona. It was the species everyone was declaring war on. and they were developing ways of spraying it with chemicals from airplanes to try to kill it. And the government spent tons and tons of money trying to set mesquite back. Mesquite is native, but it had invaded into grasslands as a result of fire suppression, the absence of fire, due both to conscious efforts to put out fires in the name of saving grass and forests, and also overgrazing. Great way to stop fires is to have the livestock come in and eat all the forage. Right? Now, these grasses here are perennial grasses, and they are the object of conservation concern. They are what we are trying to preserve in a lot of these areas, and this is northern Chihuahua. Because without grass, you can ultimately end up with this, these mesquite dune lands, where the mesquites actually send out roots and utilize all the water, and grasses don't have a chance anymore. And if you want to restore and preserve the grasslands, you need to burn the grass such that it will set back the mesquites. If you don't have any grass like this, you can't have a fire, and it's lost. You can't set it back. But if you have some kind of mix like this, there's a chance you could have a fire. So let's look at this again, this picture. These are annual grasses, not perennial grasses. The perennial grasses have been wiped out. The annual grasses come in with one good year of rainfall, and it looks all hunky-dory. The problem is that you don't realize that there are about 200 of these in every square meter of that grassland. They are coming on too. If you don't burn that grassland now, you will not control the mesquite, and the mesquite will actually take over after all. A mesquite plant can be killed by a fire at this size, but not once it's larger. And then I want to talk about prairie dogs, but I'm out of time. The prairie dogs actually turn out to be really interesting players in this. I'll tell you about that next time. Thanks.